Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first-place city, the City of Five Flags. And in our recent episode, we talked about the beginning of World War II as Pensacola's people and those around us viewed it, how people reacted to the stories as the Japanese and the Germans had been acting in military fashion in Europe and the Far East, and how our Naval Air Station had begun to prepare for the future under Captain A.C. Reed. All of these things were part of our story in the first episode, along with how our mayor, Mr. Hagler, and how the city manager, George Rourke, reacted to this. And also we talked a little bit about how several people reacted that afternoon on December the 7th, how they reacted when the word of the bombing came to them. So today we pick up the story right about that same time to look at how Pensacola and its people the next morning set out to do what they thought they needed to do. Now, just to kind of put yourself in that sort of situation, here we have been attacked by a foreign power. We know that this is serious. We want to do our part. And everyone, I suspect just about everyone in the Pensacola area felt just that way, and many of them did. For example, the civic clubs, and we had about half a dozen of that time, quickly came together. They called emergency meetings to say, okay, the city manager, the air station, someone may call upon us for some specific duty. We want to be ready. Let's get our act together so that we can perform well when that call does come. And indeed, all of them did. At the same time, service organizations like the American Red Cross, the YMCA, the Salvation Army began putting together plans that, in a sense, would duplicate the services they had provided during World War I. Almost at once, each one of these organizations visualized action overseas. And every one of those three began a campaign. And interestingly enough, each one had about the same goal, about trying to raise about $20,000 to put representatives overseas to assist the military when they got there. And the Salvation Army, for example, had as their slogan, "We will be with your boy overseas," and that caught on quite well, and the responses to those appeals were very good. Well, basically, what was going on in the war itself, as the community kind of settled down, we need to be sure that we know how things were going. The Japanese, of course, had made their attack on Pearl Harbor, and they were continuing to send their forces into action in other parts of the Far East, and our Navy had been badly decimated by the attack, and people were trying to put together the remains of what they would do. How were they going to overcome those difficulties? In the Philippine Islands, which were incidentally in the fear of a coming war, many people thought the Japanese might attack there. People in the Philippines began to prepare for what might come to them, and this is when General MacArthur was in charge there, along with General Wainwright, and they prepared positions in such places as Manila and on Corregidor, and all of them trying to get ready as they knew they must for the days ahead. On the other side of the world, the situation in the battles for territory in the east, this is where the Germans and the Russians were having at it, and to this point the Germans were still doing quite well in the latter part of 1941 and early 1942. The British, of course, were very, very pleased that we had gotten into the war that way. They were even more delighted when just a few days after the Japanese attack upon our facilities at Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. It wasn't the other way around. Germany declared war on us, and of course the English were just delighted with that, because that meant that our country was going to be immediately an active ally for them in Europe, and that, of course, is exactly what did happen. Early in 1942, as the days went by, the United States and its people got a real morale boost when some aviators put together in a game plan over close to us at Eglin Field, put together a force, and taking off from an aircraft carrier, a group of bombers flew and bombed the area in and around Tokyo in the famous Jimmy Doolittle raid in Japan was a great morale booster here, and I think it was it got the attention of the Japanese as well. Well, in the community itself now, people began to put things together, and one of the first things, of course, as we mentioned last time, that Mayor Hagler and City Manager Rourke put together an organization of air raid wardens and emergency personnel for functions that they might need, and the training went on through 1941 and into 42, and these people were functioning and doing their job and doing it quite well. Happily, there were no great emergencies they had to react to, but the job was being done, and if nothing else, this was a sense of morale building for the community, because we were doing things that we knew that we really needed to do. Beyond that, of course, the industries immediately were springing into play, and one of the first things that happened, beyond the activation, even more activation for Newport and Armstrong Cork Company and Florida Drum and the Escambia Treating Company, there was action to reopen the Pensacola shipyard. Now, by 1941-42, many people here had forgotten we had ever had a real shipyard here, but we had a very large one on the shores of Bayou Chico, and that, of course, was to serve in 1917 and 18. But now, with different ownership, that yard was reestablished, and so by the time we got into the second quarter of 1942, the shipyard was hiring people and bringing additional equipment in. They already had as many orders as they could possibly handle from the federal government basically for commercial vessels as well as deep sea tugs and barges. They were working just as fast as they could. This, of course, meant that they had to have people. And so this organization, plus some of the other industries, began recruiting out of town, and people began to come in to take those jobs. And that created a whole new problem for the community, because we didn't have a whole lot of hotel facilities here, not to take care of the large numbers of working people. And consequently, the question, where are these people going to stay? Where are we going to house them? And it was kind of interesting then that both the Chamber of Commerce and the newspapers came together with a kind of a joint appeal, asking individual householders if they had a spare room, someplace that they could take care of someone on a temporary basis, or perhaps longer than that. Would they rent a room? And basically, people responded very well to this. And incidentally, that appeal, which began early in 1942, continued on through the entire war, because each of the major employers here kept hiring more and more people. And many of them are coming from out of town, and this need was certainly present right there. Well, at the same point, of course, the government said, well, we know this war is going to be terribly expensive. So FDR and the Congress came up with some figures. They were talking about having to manufacture 50,000 airplanes and train 30,000 pilots and build an unknown number of vessels of one kind or another. They put a figure in 1942. They put an initial figure of $55 billion to cover the cost of the war. And this, of course, would pay for the troops and all that went with it. And that was the figure they used. And within a matter of weeks, the campaign was on to sell the United States savings bonds and savings stamps. And this is when we got the whole community involved. The schools became involved. The businesses became involved. The Boy Scouts did a wonderful job, literally going almost door to door to sell mostly savings stamps, but they became involved that way. The schools encouraged them to do this, and everybody was willing to help, and indeed that they did. And of course, at the same time, by the time we were into the latter part of February of 42, the national figures were saying, now we know from our experience in World War I that food is a weapon. We're already helping some of our allies, new allies, in providing food for their civilian populations. Now we're going to be the breadbasket of the allied world, and that meant that there was a huge appeal to the farmer and to anyone who might be related to that. And one industry that in Pensacola itself that had been around since 1889, that was quickly caught up, and this was what was then called the Agrico Fertilizer Company, just off of Fairfield Drive. And they began running 3 shifts, making fertilizer that they were shipping all over the country to help agricultural interests, just about everybody. And once again, they played a wonderful role all the way through the war. Now, food was extremely important, because this was something that you not only the emphasis here was not only growing it, but using it wisely. And this was at a point where the 4-H 4-H club people got involved. Lots of women's groups got involved. With newspapers began to publish all sorts of instructions and suggestions on how you make best use of food. Don't waste it. And then people began to say, "No, what, are we going to have shortages? Are we going to have a shortage of beef and pork and all that went with it?" And the answer was yes, we probably are. So let's start to think in terms of meals that we can provide that will be healthful and certainly nourishing, but things that where we can have a fine filling meal but not have to use meat of any kind. And so this is when companies such as Kraft began really pushing the pasta things that they made easily available in cartons and special kits that you maybe for as small a group as one, fixing the man's lunch with a little box of spaghetti. So it worked, and people were just so much a part of that they did. Okay, now we began to worry about other kinds of items because now by the time we were at the end of January 1942, people were fully aware that we were in trouble with some of the fundamentals of living. Number one, automobiles were, as of the end of January, automobiles were rationed. That meant that from that point forward, only people with a particular priority were going to be able to buy a new car. That meant that the cars that people already had to be nursed along. And you got to remember now, we're just at the end of a depression, so many of the automobiles being driven by Pensacola people were old. They might be 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And so the automobile dealers who no longer had anything new to sell began working very hard, very consciously to help these people maintain their cars. And of course, now the word began to come out across the entire industry. We're going to have a shortage of batteries. We're going to have a shortage of tires. We're going to have a shortage of gasoline. All of these things had to be taken into consideration. And by the time we get into February of 1942, we were moving in the direction of having these things actually rationed, so that each family that had a vehicle would get a series of ration books that they could use for whatever purchases that they might need to make. And once again, people here cooperated very, very fully in this. They just did a fine job. As all of this was going on, of course, Pensacola's social life did not stop. Bless them all. You could follow the newspaper accounts of this time that weddings kept coming. People were still having parties. Dancing was still popular. The dance pavilions around Pensacola were doing well. Some of the local bands, people like Frank Marchese and Frank Horn with their little bands were popular every weekend, because people they were now beginning to concentrate and think intensely on war, but they wanted to break too. And of course, this year our Class D baseball team again was going to take the field, and it did. And so basically, we were having just a good time when this was appropriate. And bless their hearts, as we move into the war a little bit, war years a little bit further, the Pensacola Little Theater and a new civic orchestra were formed to perform for the local community, so people would have a chance to enjoy a life in that way. So basically, as we moved into the midpoint of 1942, good things were happening in terms of what we were able to do to be a part. The West Florida Paper Company, which had been under construction when the war announcement came, now they were making paper out at Cantonment, and they announced very shortly they would announce that they were getting orders in such volume that they were going to set aside $800,000 to expand that mill so it could make more paper. Armstrong Cork Company and Newport Industries and all of the others, they were going to 3 shifts, and they were beginning to by the time we got to the middle of 1942, the shortage of workers was now becoming critical, because some of their regular people were being accepted into the draft. So now we began to see the employment for the first time in these industries of women in actual production, that is, not in administrative roles. So all of this is happening, and as we come to the end of to the middle of 1942, you can see all of these people beginning to take place, and along Palafox Street, the merchants are doing what they can, because now by the time you get to that point, they're becoming short on some of their inventories as well. And that's another point of rationing that we'll talk about in another one of our episodes just a little bit later.